A Day Out at the Dimensional Gardens, written and read by Toby Bennett. Alyce and Wally kneeled in their seats with their faces pressed to the windows as they pulled into the station at the Dimensional Gardens. "Gosh," Alyce said, "it's so magnificent." "You say that every time," Wally said with contempt. "We've only been here once before." Wally looked down his tiny nose at her. How typical of a girl to think you need to go somewhere more than once to get bored of it. "Don't be such a spud, Wally. You know you loved it last time, and stop saying silly things about girls." Wally peeled his face from the steamy window and stuck out his tongue. Alyce sighed. "You know you want to go just as much as I do." Wally put his tongue away. "All right then, but you know it's going to be boring. Mater and Pater are meeting this colonel and they won't let me go off on my own. Pater didn't even let me go and ask the driver if I could ride up front." Alyce briefly wondered what the world must look like to her precocious younger brother. He must think the whole universe was just there to amuse him. Not that anyone could be blamed for such an assumption when they were privileged enough to see the panorama of purple stars winking just beyond the confines of the great glass dome that contained the gardens. "Look at that," she said, pointing. "Bet I've seen it before," Wally said, pointedly looking at his feet. "Wally, don't be a boob." Her little brother's resistance to the spectacle outside proved fleeting. Wally twisted in his seat, flattened himself to the window again, and studied the glowing skies. "I suppose it's pretty enough. For girls, anyway." Alyce tried to grab at him over the seat, but as she did she heard her father's voice. "Manners, young lady." "Yes, Daddy." She threw her brother a dark look. She'd been looking forward to coming back to the gardens forever, and now Wally was already ruining it. Sometimes she just wanted to... "I was going to say," she looked her brother in the eye, "I was going to say that if you were nice and didn't ruin it for me, that I'd ask Father if we could both go for a stroll after tea." Wally's eyes lit up at that, but he wasn't going to be tamed so easily. "And you promise I can catch some dragons?" She bit her lip. "We're not supposed to." "But there are so many of them." He sniffed and offered a grubby hand. "Please, just a few, please, Alyce." He looked up at her, making the most of his big eyes. It was no wonder he thought the world revolved around him. Everyone gave in to him when he gave them that look. "All right," she agreed. "But you have to be good, and you have to let me choose when to ask." "You said after the tea starts." His lower lip began to jut out. "I did, but I want Father to be in a good mood." Wally cast a pained glance towards his long-suffering father. "He never is. He gets upset over the silliest things. Like when I used his ties to make a rope, or when I lost his pocket watch. It might have belonged to Grandfather, but it couldn't tell time well if it was that old, could it? And... Children." Their father stood waiting at the exit to the train. "Yes, Daddy," they said in unison and went scampering down the aisle. The station itself was just as impressive as the interior of the noble old engine that they had arrived in. The platform was made of great slabs bounded by wrought iron fences that had been made to resemble curling leaves. There was brass and glass everywhere, as befitted the age when the gardens had been constructed. Alyce looked around. She could hardly breathe with excitement. It seemed like every star ever born was visible in the cosmos that swirled beyond the great bubble overhead. She could already smell the exotic scent of the spice trees and sweet-tip bushes that grew so lush at the entrance to the garden. There were perhaps a few too many people for her liking, families like her own, roaming in gawping packs or couples walking arm in arm. Here and there learned-looking gentlemen in grey suits and wistful-looking women in flared skirts walked alone. But they all stayed on the paths, and that was something Alyce had promised herself she would not do this time. As much as Wally could be annoying, he wasn't wrong in his urge to be free of parental supervision. Alyce could only imagine what she might find away from the press of so many other visitors. All she had to do was smile sweetly and time it right, and she knew her father would relent. He'd give the big speech about not getting lost and staying safe, and then they'd be free to roam the gardens and see all the beautiful things that had been brought there from so many different ever so far away places. "Look over there, they've got cotton candy!" her brother yelled at the top of his voice and pulled on her arm. Alyce didn't know how she'd get much peace with Wally around. That was a problem for later. Right now the trick would be to get away from the adults. Wally would probably tire himself out chasing dragons, and then she could do her own thing. Father herded them through the magnificent entrance, stopping only to buy them both a cotton candy. Alyce picked at hers, but Wally was soon wearing most of his as a huge pink beard. It gave him a strange similarity with the man that their father was here to meet. The colonel was a gruff-looking man with a set of whiskers that could hide a small squad of infantry, though it was much better kept than Wally's new facial adornment, and didn't attract as many flies. "Ho, ho! And who have we here?" the colonel cried in a jovial manner when he saw them coming. He bounded over with a vigour that was belied by his rotund physique and stark white hair. His cheeks were rosy by the time he met them. "Good to see you again, John," he said to their father, "and unless my memory has failed me, this must be Alyce and Wally. I don't remember you being so big last time we met, young man, or so hirsute." Wally grinned from behind his cotton candy, and the colonel extended a hand, then snatched it back when he saw the state of Wally's answering paw. Alyce seized her opportunity. "Excuse me, father, but do you think that Wally and I might be permitted to take a walk for a few minutes before tea? We could find a fountain and wash his hands." Wally's eyes bulged. "You will do no such thing! Why, of all the cheek for a girl to—" Alyce quickly handed him her half-eaten candy, and Wally's protests ended. She looked at her father and did a very creditable impression of the look her younger brother had given her earlier. Her father glanced over to the colonel, who was twirling extra moustache wax into his impressive white tusks. Alyce knew her father was on a knife edge about the decision. Had she played her cards too soon? Then she saw his stern face soften as he knelt by her side. "All right, but you keep an eye on your brother, and don't wander off too far. The colonel and I will be in the luncheon area by the fountain. No matter what, I want you to keep that fountain in sight. Understood?" Alyce nodded vigorously, then leapt to wrap her arms around him and pepper him with kisses. Her father's face broke into a warm smile. He chuckled as he stood and planted Alyce back on her feet. "Oh, thank you, father," she said. "Mind what I said," her father intoned, momentarily becoming serious again. "Eyes on the fountain." He pointed to the ornate marble structure half hidden by the crowds that swarmed around it. Some came to admire the craftsmanship, others to listen to the musical tinkle of the water. The superstitious threw glittering halfpennies into the clear pool at the fountain's base, as if the coins could purchase wishes, hopes, and dreams that could not be bought at any greater cost. "Yes, father, we won't go far," she promised. "Wally," her father called to her brother, who had already half disappeared into the bushes, "you listen to your sister." A look of horror darkened the boy's features. "But, papa, that's not fair," he whined. "She's the eldest, so you mind what she tells you. And for goodness sake, don't you scuff those new shoes, or your mother will have me take the belt to you." Wally pouted, but Alyce knew it was only for show. Youthful defiance. Her father returned his attention to his old friend the colonel, and they began speaking in earnest. Alyce waited where she stood, mentally counting. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Sure enough, at 3,000, her father looked back to make sure they hadn't immediately gotten into trouble. Alyce waved enthusiastically until her father, satisfied that they weren't on fire or in danger of losing a limb, turned his attention back to the rotund military man. Alyce reckoned they were in the clear now. Father would be lost in conversation for a good while. Now was their chance to... "Wally, where are you?" Drat! A few seconds and the little blighter was already up to mischief. "Wally!" she repeated, then hurriedly glanced back to make sure her father hadn't heard. He was off in the distance with the colonel on the far side of the fountain, half hidden by the cascading sheets of water. "Ah, what?" called her brother. His voice was faint. Alyce was unsure as to whether it was due to the distance or the muffling of the foliage between them. "Wait for me," she called to him, and instantly got a huffed sigh in response. Alyce forced her way between the first bushes her brother had crawled through. This can't be the easiest route. Why does he always have to be difficult? There's a path that goes to the... Alyce caught her breath as she stepped out into a lush garden hidden from the paths and walkways. For an instant it felt like a secret place known only to her. She could spend all day just... Then she noticed her brother. Wally was running across the emerald lawn at full tilt, and from the looks of things was liable to trip up and stain the knee of his trousers at any moment. Alyce didn't want to try and explain that to Mother. "Wally!" She jogged after him, though her caution at crossing the damp grass made the pursuit farcical. She wasn't halfway across the lawn before she slowed and stared up at the three ornate pagodas that followed the gentle weave of a small stream as it coiled down the hill. They were of a foreign yet immensely appealing design, with swirling dragons and other strange beasts she could not identify carved into the dark wood of the structures. Each was subtly different, yet each fit perfectly with its neighbour and the lush growth around it. Wally had crossed a small bridge that arched over the stream at the other end of the lawn. He was already near the bounding shrubberies, making airship battle noises through pursed lips. She couldn't let him just go running off through the bushes alone. She would have to risk moving faster if she didn't want to lose sight of her headstrong brother. "Wally, stop rushing!" she called to him. But he was oblivious, caught up in a world of his own devising, playing sky cavalry. Alyce put to chase. Her longer legs helped her cover more ground, and she was a few paces from the enraptured Wally when she felt her shoes sliding on the wet grass. "No!" She tried to slow herself, but she was already out of control and went sliding across the lawn. "You little beast!" she howled at Wally. It was just typical that she'd fallen when he'd been the one running. All she'd been trying to do was make sure he didn't ruin his clothes, and now look at her. Her stockings had torn at the knee, and she could only imagine the grass stain that must be on the back of her skirt. "Wally, you come back here right now, or I'm calling Dad." The grin that had shattered when she had fallen returned to Wally's face. "No, you won't." "What?" "You aren't going to call Dad, because if you do, he'll see how you look, and he'll take you straight home. I was only running 'cause of you." "Liar. Anyway, that's not what I'll tell him." Wally's smile broadened. Alyce just wanted to hit him. "You're a nasty little fibber. He'll never believe you." "He will so, and you'll have to go back and tell him anyway." Alyce bit her lip. "If we stay and play for a bit, you'll say I tripped, that I wasn't running." "Of course." Alyce wasn't sure she trusted the expression on her brother's face, but she had little choice if she wanted to see the pagodas. "Right, so let's go this way," she said, pointing to the ornate structures ahead of them. "Blow me, no," Wally cried. "I'm not going to sit in some boring pagodas. I'm going to catch dragons by the river." Alyce looked down the slope to the flashing silver line of the river. If Wally went to the river, she'd be able to see him from the top of the hill. She knew Father wouldn't like it, but what could really happen? "All right, but you go and play by the river. Don't go wandering off," she warned. Wally didn't give any indication of whether he had heard her. He was too busy examining the jam jar that he'd been keeping in his pocket for just such an opportunity. Alyce could only feel sorry for the dragons. Thinking of dragons reminded Alyce of her real objective. She let Wally run off to play with the river vermin and approach the beautiful structures at the top of the rise. The biggest pagoda was nestled in the jeweled scales of an exotic snake-like dragon. This was not one of the drab little creatures that Wally would likely find down by the river. This dragon was the stuff of dreams and visions. Gold edged its crimson scales, and as Alyce stepped into the shade beneath its high-arching roof, she imagined that she was entering some ancient treasure vault or mystic lair. It seemed only fitting that there be magic in such an exotic place. Father liked to scoff at her fairy tales. To him everything was science, metal, and mathematics. He was probably talking the Colonel's ear off about the specifications of some new cannon even now. Alyce knew that there was more to the world than that. She only needed to look through the elegant arches of the pagoda to the undulating rifts in the sky above her to know that the world couldn't be so grey and lifeless. Alyce crossed to the edge of the pagoda and stared down at the river. She could just see Wally wading into the shadows. Father would want her to keep him clean, but she decided that a bit of mud on Wally would make it less likely that he would try to get her into trouble. A light breeze washed over her, filling the pagoda with the exotic scents of the garden. It was almost too much for her senses, and as she settled back, perched on the dragon's scales, she imagined herself an old-fashioned princess, or even a poet waiting for her lover to return from some distant war, like they were always doing in the storybooks she wasn't supposed to read. She was so engrossed in her daydreaming that she almost didn't notice the fairy landing clumsily next to her foot. She heard a ragged droning, and then she saw the little creature standing there. At first she thought the interloper was some kind of big insect, and she scrambled back, but then she noticed that it had 4 limbs rather than 6. The fairy's body was covered in metallic plates that rippled with colour in the light of the rifts above, like the abdomen of a blue jug or a gull wasp. It occurred to Alyce that the metallic coat might not be its real skin, but rather some kind of covering. Armour! He must be a fairy knight! Smoke rose from one of the wings at the fairy knight's back, and she saw that half the wing was missing. "Are you hurt?" she asked. Lights flared along the fairy knight's body, and it raised something in its arms. It reminded Alyce of the sketches of cannons that she'd seen in her father's desk. "Don't be silly, there's no need to be afraid," she said to the fairy knight as she quickly plucked the weapon away. "If your wing is broken, I'll help you get home." Alyce set aside the tiny cannon and lifted the fairy as gently as she could. She felt the little creature struggling in her hand, but she resisted the urge to squeeze back. The poor thing was probably frightened and didn't know what was good for it. Alyce had read enough to know that where there was one fairy, there had to be a fairy mound nearby. "Don't worry," she assured him. "I'll take you back, and then your friends can fix your wing." The fairy knight went still as if it understood. Alyce decided to risk opening her hand a bit. As soon as she did, the fairy's wings began to whir, but the damaged wing shuddered to a halt after only a few beats. "Don't be silly, just show me which way to take you." The fairy knight slumped against the side of her hand. Alyce waited patiently for directions. When none were forthcoming, she cast about, trying to guess where fairies might hide in the garden. She stared longingly at the distant stands of starflower trees, and she could hear the tinkling of the ice chimes beyond that. But these seemed more like the places she wanted to go than anywhere the fairy knight would be safe. The thick vegetation by the river seemed the more likely place for the tiny knight to have come from. After all, fairies typically lived at the bottom of gardens, didn't they? Alyce was pondering this when she caught a glimpse of her father strolling through the throngs in the distance. She caught her breath. She had become so distracted by the pagoda and the fairy that she must have lost track of time. That or his meeting hadn't gone well. Wally. There'd be hell to pay if her father knew she'd lost track of him. Alyce dashed down the slope away from the pagoda. She had to find Wally before her father reached them. She just hoped he wasn't too many. The broad path running along the riverbank was choked with people in their best suits and dresses. The general hum of their murmured conversations was a curtain of noise that seemed altogether too jarring after the stillness of the pagoda. Alyce suddenly felt like a swimmer coming up from a long dive in a deep pool. All the serenity she had known in the last few minutes was gone, replaced by the burning need to rise again and take a breath. Alyce plunged into the stream of walkers and was almost immediately apologizing to a young man for running into his legs. "Be more careful, my dear," the man said in restrained tones as he straightened the crease in his white trousers. Alyce wondered if he would have been quite so restrained if his walking companion had not been watching the interchange from under her lace parasol. "I will, sir," she panted. "Sorry, sir." "I should think so, what?" The young man tried to quickly snatch up the cigarette case that had been bumped from one of his pockets. "Oh, Simon," his companion whined, "you promised to lay off tobacco." "I know, my sweet, but my father gave me the case, and—" The buzzing in Alyce's hand reminded her of the urgency of her situation. She closed her hand a bit tighter and prayed she would not hurt the knight. All her reading told her that fairies were secretive by nature. The knight would no doubt thank her for keeping his secret once he was better recovered. That was, if father didn't find her before she could get him home. Father! He could be walking towards her even now, and she'd never see him coming. She had to get the fairy back and talk to Wally before they were caught. Alyce pushed her way through the traffic and darted into the undergrowth on the side of the path. She thought she might have heard someone call her name, but she didn't look around. She paid the faint voice no more mind than the brambles clawing at the fabric of her dress. "They can't blame me if he ran off," she told herself. She was convincing herself of her own innocence as she broke through the screen of branches and looked down on the river. For an instant she despaired of ever finding Wally before her father arrived, but then she saw a pair of shoes in the mud to her left. "Wally!" Alyce let out an outraged shout, then remembered that she didn't want to be found yet. If she could get the worst of the mud off Wally, father might not be too upset. "Wally!" Her voice was a hoarse whisper as she willed her brother to respond. Nothing. "Blast you, Wally!" She picked her way down the bank towards the shoes. When she reached Wally's hunting spot, she found herself looking down at his scratched-up old jam jar. A fat blue dragon squatted on the stone that Wally had thoughtfully inserted. The tiny monster was asleep, no doubt burdened by the meal it had made of the smaller black dragon that lay smouldering in the water around the rock. Every so often the blue's tail would slip into the water, and the tiny spark from its electric body would ignite the gas rising from the film of spilt black dragon bile. Alyce had no time for the tiny fireworks display. "Wally!" She stooped over the imprint of a bare foot. He had gone into the nearby stand of mulberry trees. The silver fur on the broad leaves bristled as if the plant were breathing. "Wally, answer me!" Still nothing. She thrust aside the low-hanging branches, ignoring the mild discomfort of the tiny silver barbs, and stared into the gloom. Wally was there all right, but he was lying flat on his face. Alyce's attention was immediately drawn to the dim lights twinkling in the tree branches above her. As her eyes adjusted to the dull illumination, she could see that Wally's body was wreathed in tiny wounds. These were not the burns that every child got on their fingers from handling reluctant dragons. They were livid holes, some of them bone deep, tinged with soot and carbonized flesh. A shrill noise emanated from beyond the lights, and Alyce could just make out a bulbous structure hung between the branches of the mabe. The weight of the hive, that's what she supposed it must be, was enough that the sturdy branches were bowed over. This was why the leaves had been so low, and why she hadn't seen Wally in the first place. "Wally?" There was a cold knot in her stomach. "Wally, get up! Stop fooling!" Her brother remained still, but the hive exploded into activity. There was a familiar hum of fairy wings, and the space under the tree was quickly filled with tiny forms like the one she still clutched in her hand. "Please," she tried. "I don't mean any harm. I just want to get my brother and—" Something flashed in the space between the girl and her attackers. A streaking comet that exploded on her arm, releasing a tiny mushroom cloud. Alyce yelped in pain. "No, please!" She couldn't run, couldn't go back to her father without Wally. She did the only thing she could think to do and held up the hand with the fairy knight in it. Another trail of fire split the gloom, and she winced as the missile burst on her shoulder, leaving a smouldering hole in her dress. She opened her fingers and the battered knight stood. "Please stop!" The swarm flew closer, and two of the fairies buzzed down to alight on her hand. Despite her distress, she watched in awe as the damaged knight's armor split open and a tiny man, no bigger than her fingernails, scurried down the suit. One of the other knights scooped him up, and they were gone in an instant. Alyce looked down at the armor. Even more smoke was rising from it. "You see," she shouted, "I wasn't going to hurt you. I brought him back, and now—" "For God's sake, what are you doing, miss?" Alyce had only a moment to register the arrival of one of the park's many workers. "You want to lose your hand?" the man cried, snatching the smoking armor and flinging it away into the bushes. The suit exploded before it hit the ground in a livid fireball that would indeed have incinerated Alice's hand had she still been holding it. The fairies fled back to their hive in consternation. "Not so fast, you bloody pests!" the custodian cried. He produced a heavy spray gun and sent a puff of green-coloured vapour after them. Metal bodies began to steam and melt. Only half the fairies made it back. "What are you doing?" Alyce cried, momentarily forgetting the damage the fairies had done her. "Saving you is what," the custodian replied. "Nasty blighters, those, always cracking the dimensional web, and when they do—" The man trailed off as he registered Wally's still form. "Oh, Gord," he whispered. "Alyce?" Her father's voice reached them from the path above. "Da!" She bawled for him as she would have when she was a much younger child. "Alyce, are you all right? Where are you?" "Down here, Da. It's terrible. Wally ran off and—" Alice's father wasted no time in rushing down the bank. When he reached them, his fine white suit was as ruined as Alice's dress. It got further stained as he reached down and scooped up his son, feeling for a pulse. Alyce stood with the custodian. The hive had detached itself from the tree and was leaving at surprising speed. Alyce followed the custodian as he stepped out from under the trees and observed the path of the blurred object. There was no mistaking the hive's destination. A majestic blue planet sporting a single moon hovered on one of the display plinths near the bridge. Even at a distance it was obvious that the clear bubble of the dimensional webbing had been cracked. The custodian sighed. "Is that where the fairies came from?" Alyce asked. She deliberately didn't turn around or register her father's sobbing. "It was," the custodian agreed grimly. "But I reckon this should put paid to that. No way we can have it around after this. It's a pity, but what can management expect? They only gave us 7 days to set the damn thing up."